Okay, great.
All right.
All right.
So we're going. Go ahead.
Thank you. Enjoy. All right. Hey, folks. So we're back, and I will note the first thing I will do is make a reminder to myself so the Friday before I actually make sure the agenda is updated. So kind of fail for letting people know first thing this morning, and I appreciate those who called in last minute knowing what the agenda is. So with that, actually, let me pull up the agenda because Justin and I had a couple of things I wanted to share. So there's two, as with anything, trying to get things written down kind of helps not just help others figure out what it is we're talking about, but also organize our own thoughts. So over the last week, a couple of things have been happening. Justin couldn't make the call last week, but he was able to listen to the call, and we were joking because he was like dying to answer the questions. It was a one-way recording. So we had a couple of things go on last week with he had written a doc that was really helpful to try to put some context together. All of the feedback I had been getting on the scenarios got to the point where it's hard to just read through them. So Sam and I met last week and worked through a bunch of those. I have not had a chance to update it with my notes. That's my to-do this week, is to make sure I kind of put more clarity on it. The biggest, I think, the biggest piece of thought process was trying to digest all the pieces that we've been thinking that we want to get into what we think of as Notary V2, realizing it's way beyond what we should try to do in the individual project versus take advantage of other projects that are going on and figure out, not that we have a dependency on it per se, but how do we separate, you've been using the phrase separation of concerns, where we have the stuff we're trying to do in Notary and the things that we need from the scenarios that we're trying to use Notary for, but probably shouldn't be in the exact Notary project. So in the doc, so I'll use this as setup, but then I really want to spend most of the time in Justin's doc and let him run with it. The context was, and it's in the link in the agenda items, I put together a quick Google Doc on that the conversation last week or the week before around how do we certify the particular version of MySQL was an interesting one. And that is, should the Notary effort or even the registry know that it is this very specific version of MySQL as opposed to like MySQL 2.71, which I'm not sure it's a valid number, but that was the things we were using. If it's not that, I don't want to run this image. And that implies a couple of things. So one of the elements that we said is, let's make sure that an artifact put in the registry, such as the MySQL image, can be signed. So we know this thing came from MySQL, and including being able to move between registries and all that fun stuff. The next one is if somebody wants to say, I want to make sure I can only run 2.7 and 1 and above, where does that go? So there is a software bill of materials working group that's been happening, and which if I have an SBOM, that thing of course needs to be signed also, otherwise it's just some random document that anybody can make. So we would sign that as well with Notary. But then a policy manager, say Open Policy Agent, or pick your policy manager, can look in the SBOM, know it's signed, so it knows it's valid, and say, I only allow things from MySQL that are 2.71 and above to run. And I'd put that policy on my runtime host, let's say it's Kubernetes, and voila, we've got the end-to-end kind of pulled together. The thought process there is allows us as the Notary group, working group, to worry about signing artifacts, and we really don't care what the content is. We just say this thing is signed. There's a question of how do we, and I think this is part of what Justin will go into with the claims and so forth of, or maybe not. Anyway, that how do we associate an artifact with its SBOM that are both signed individually or signed together through possibly an index? But the main premise here is we can focus on signing things in a registry and all of those details would be used by something with policy management, look at something else. So that was the setup. Before I hand off to Justin, I'll leave it open for thoughts on that. Okay, chomping on.
Technically, it works, of course. My concern in there is that every time I talk to users, they just say that they want a signature of an opaque artifact, but when you dig into their threat model, they need to verify the versions. So if we just give them the users the tools without guiding them in any way, they are very likely to choose the wrong thing. And separately, I'm concerned about interoperability. If we just say this is the artifact and don't define what the bill of materials should look like, we are likely to end up with non-interoperable implementations, and it loses a lot of the benefit. Of course, there can be a separate profile or something, and if you want to keep it out of scope, that's technically fine. It's just something that needs to happen, I feel.
So I'm trying to follow so I get the question of interoperability. You know, if we have this spec that says what Notary accounts for with, you know, whatever we want to account for, what's out of scope, but we say the things that can be signed, and an SBOM is yet another thing that can be signed, and there's one particular working group that's working on a standard a bunch of us are involved with. Whether or not that one succeeds or something else does, there's another way to say, and somebody can just make up their own SBOM for that matter, and as long as they trust it, that's fine. It's signed. That's the part that we again worry about. As long as there's a spec, what's the level of interoperability that you're concerned with? That's what I'm missing.
I mean, I guess another way of looking, I mean, if you look at package managers, they tend to sign a smaller set of metadata, such as just the version number and the package name, which is more like signing just the tag and the org, say. I mean, and so then as long as you trust the person who signed that gives you, like, so it's signed as MySQL : 3.6, but not with the registry information, but just that much, then that might be effectively at a kind of, effectively that's kind of what I think what I tried to capture, but maybe I wasn't specific enough in my doc, is as the kind of minimal use case where you just sign the tag and use, like, if I sign this as MySQL 3.6 and you trust my signature, then that's sufficient, and you don't need a full SBOM and a full provenance if that's enough.
The interoperability concern is basically the container ecosystem scale. If a vendor provides a container that can run on some other version of Linux, and the container itself is interoperable, I would want this bill of materials to be interoperable as well.
I mean, what exactly do you mean by interoperable? Do you mean everyone uses the same standard, or do you mean?
I mean that if the vendor signs the software, then the consumers can verify the signature, including the bill of materials, or including the version information to be specific about what I care about.
So, so would that be the tag that is in the registry? Would that be a sufficient version number? Assuming it wasn't latest.
Oh, I would prefer something that includes the product version, a product name as well, so that you can have a single public key per vendor, and you don't have to separately establish a public key for every single product.
Yeah, I think the thing that I was trying to tease out, because the question that kind of made my head hurt a little bit last time with the version number stuff was differentiating 1.0 versus 2.0. Like there's a policy that says I only allow 2.0 and above, and I don't want the 1.0. The question then kind of came out of it is, are those separate key? I think I was saying separate signatures, by the way, and of course they're separate signatures. The question is, are those separate keys so that I can tell that the MySQL 2.0 is a different key than 1.0? Because if they are the same key, then what exactly is the particular information that says it definitely is version 2.0, and is it a semantic version, or is it a string, or whatever? So the way I was kind of wrestling my head around that was, sorry, let me go the opposite way and fill in the other piece of it. The other reason why I'm nervous around having a key specific, or even a signature, because if there's a signature for a 2.71, then, and it's only 2.71, because there's, of course, everything that's signed by MySQL is a separate signature. The problem is, what happens when MySQL puts out a servicing release at 2.71, which should have a 2.71 tag on it, but it's the newer version, so that somebody is pulling 2.71, gets the latest, and they're still signed by MySQL, but of course it's a different signature than the previous 2.71, because that's the patched version. And there's a 2.7.1 point, a specific build number as a best practice as well.
I don't think you would normally have a separate key per release. I mean, well, it's not very common. A few people do that, but it's complicated. I mean, yeah, not for this kind of situation. It would just be signed with the MySQL key,
right,
regardless of version, and then but it would sign the metadata that has the version in as well, so that you can verify the version.
But what metadata? Like, are you just saying there's an arbitrary?
Well, just a version number potentially, or if it's a MySQL key, or the name or the product name MySQL and the version number. So effectively, maybe the repo and the tag in effect, if it's, but not anything else.
So I don't want to preclude that annotations, and of course anything that's an annotation, we've said previously, anything that's in the manifest gets signed. So if somebody puts an annotation for a version and somebody wants to evaluate it, then that's awesome, right? We don't want to make a dependency on SBOMs, but I'm just suggesting that to formalize something larger like versioning and other things, that instead of trying to standardize on a set of annotations or other properties in a manifest, which would be hard for us to endlessly chase, that somebody could do that, they could leverage it, but we would actually suggest, if you want to do more formal versioning or any kind of formal validation, such as what packages were in this thing that later on it's determined there's vulnerabilities in, that's what we would say, hey, this is a great thing to leverage these SBOMs, which by the way, they're signed as well. And that would be the kind of the best practice recommendation. It doesn't preclude annotations that somebody can use, just kind of a leaning in on that direction.
I can't say that I'm satisfied, but that's not new still. I mean, the contents of the package scan results in individual packages. Sure, that's out of scope. Keep it elsewhere. But the product conversion information, that feels to me like an essential part. If the user wants to get an image, we should just ensure that the user gets the right image.
I'm sorry, you said something important that I didn't quite get it. I heard it was important. I heard about the vulnerability scanners, and of course, various vulnerability scanners will do their assessment. The part of, and I don't want, I'm intentionally trying not to do scope creep, but I'm also trying to show where this scenario would be outside of what we should take over, but there's huge value and we should lean into. And what I'm getting at is, there's there's an effort around a standardization for how do I know what vulnerabilities are in what and how, what's the history of those. And that's what the SBOM team is working on, that we are working with the security scanners for them to leverage as well. But I shouldn't have to, if MySQL is publishing scan results from Aqua, if I happen to use Twistlock, I shouldn't have to rescan it. There should be some list of bill of materials that are in the bill of materials document, and I shouldn't have to rescan it just to find out if that's in it, because some of these things, such as what compiler was used, you can't even necessarily determine by scanning it. So that's why there's this push for this SBOM. Does that make sense? Okay.
I think maybe we should. Shall we read my doc now? Because I think some of those questions come up in there as well, and I think there are still different options that we could.
Okay. Why don't we do that? And why don't we do what Omar said, right thing to, let's take 3 minutes, five minutes to read it. I don't know what, I didn't read how long it would take. So let's just take a couple of minutes, read the doc, scan it, and then we can speak to something that's written and with notes.
Just for context, this was me trying to summarize the kinds of statements that people were making at last week's meeting, plus some thinking I've been doing, so it's a little bit broad, but I just kind of thought it would be useful to discuss.
Are we talking about the dividing and conquering, or about the what we signed document?
The what we signed document that Justin put in. I gave a quick summary to the other one. You're welcome to read that too, but this one is really focused on Justin's doc. Okay, we're at 5 minutes. So, Justin, go.
So, yeah, so these seem to be the three kinds of ways of signing that people seem to be suggesting, and I think which are used in various places. I kind of hand-wavily related them to Git signing and Notary V1 signing and then Toto signing, although there's a lot of details that kind of skips over. I think that there's there's a long thread tags in registries, and what that actually means if you move the tag and how that might actually work. I mean, I think and I think I didn't explain it very well what that might mean, because I think actually it could mean potentially more than one thing. But there were a couple of thoughts about that. One of which is just the kind of you know if you wanted to sign a manifest, that's effectively just signing a blob. It doesn't matter what it's called or where it comes from. It's just signing a blob, and that's obviously the first section. That's relatively straightforward. If you just sign a blob, you're just saying, I signed this thing with this SHA and it's fine. But there is the question of, most people who are using a registry actually retrieve things by name, not by blob. And therefore, they might also want to know that that's actually a valid name that was added by someone who was allowed to add names, in the same way as that you want to know that your Git tag is a valid tag that the maintainers put in, and not just some random tag that got modified later by someone else. So my feeling was that tag would probably be, I mean, there's a question about what that tag is, whether it's the whole path or just literally the actual tag. So are you signing 3.6, or are you signing MySQL 3.6, or are you signing docker.io/library/MySQL/3.6? So there's actually somewhat of a problem around actually what you sign. And obviously we think we don't want to sign the domain name. So there's a bunch of question marks about what is it meaningful to sign in a registry context, if anything. We could have a much simpler system if we simply signed blobs and decided that names were not trustable at all. But because I was considering this as the Git model, I put both options in because Git supports both things.
With Git though, I'm not sure, does the tag can point to something else, right? If I Git tag something, I can later on point the tag to something else.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Git is mutable. I mean, obviously you're not supposed to mutate it, but yeah, you can move tags.
So the thing that I'm trying to get my head around is the assumption is a manifest is the only thing that's actually unique, and by definition, and by spec is what I mean. A tag by definition can be updatable, but while not in the spec, many registries have made them immutable using different names. So my thought was we should always have the manifest signed because it's the only thing that's truly unique. And as long as the tag, whatever I happen to call it in whatever registry, points to that same manifest, then I can still validate that it's signed by a certain authority and even has a certain SBOM, an optional SBOM if I want it. So
Well, so yeah, but if you ignore the SBOM for the moment, so all those three scenarios are not actually mutually exclusive, but say you were just implementing this one, you would only be able to validate, effectively validate the hash and not the tag.
Well, but if I it by the tag, which points to a manifest, why couldn't I use that manifest as the signature? No, it's like, and this is why I use the DLL and from example. Like when I sign a
It
binary,
doesn't sign the name that you've retrieved things that you've retrieved. It just, so you can't tell what version it was supposed to be.
well, that's why I was trying to defer that to.
But so,
I
yes,
just
if you
want to
defer
know,
that to an SBOM,
Mhm.
that's fine. In which case you say, I don't need this feature, I'm going to use the SBOM. And that's effectively what the second section is suggesting. But if you don't want to go through this SBOM process, effectively what Notary V1 does is it does provide a signed name for an item, so that you can trust the name. I mean, basically Notary V1 is a signed alternative to the built-in registry mechanism for naming things. With some extra complicated features, but it's more or less it lets you trust the name was the one that the maintainer actually intended you to get when you put MySQL 3.6 in. Is the one that the
now I want to go look at what the actual versions of my
confidence that using 3.6
Yeah.
is okay, but it's not. It might not be the actual version of 3.6, but the person who put it in the registry, who is someone you trust, says it's 3.6. So it's some validation that 3.6 is meaningful.
So you're
it's
trying
kind of
to
in a sense, I think it's the minimal thing you could do without having to have any more complicated validation. Would be we provide some means that you can validate that the provider of this image actually put that tag on it.
But that's the part that makes me nervous, is anything to do with the naming. If we enforce anything, I'm not worried about the registry or even the paths to the registry, right? The namespaces. So I think while we haven't come up with a consistent way to refer them by name, I think we all know generally that that's the part we want to exclude from the signature part. And I don't know, what I get a little nervous about is when we move these things between repos, whether the image name, the actual artifact name, right? The last part, like basically the thing just to the left of the colon and to the right of the colon, do we believe that we can freeze those in such a way that that can be the thing we actually sign? And maybe that's just exactly the kind of conversations we have to say that that's the right scope. I've seen enough people change the tag to say like 3.71-dev or -prod or -test, and they don't want it to mean something different. That's just the way that they refer to things that are in another path. Yep. Maybe what we say is that should be the namespace, and that we are signing MySQL : 3. What is the right version? 3.1. I'm going to say 3.1. I'm going to look up what the current version of MySQL is.
I have.
I don't quite see that we being prescriptive about which parts of the name can change or can't change, and dictating the layout of the repositories on a registry is all that useful. Right. I mean, when you say that we are in agreement that we don't want the host names in the signature, I don't think you actually mean that the host name must not be there, that it is bad that it is there. What you mean is that you don't want the host name matched when verifying the signature. And that's really a local policy concern of the client. And the client could just as well say that the tag can change from production to or development or testing, or the client could say that the host name can change when doing disconnected. That they can all be in the signature, it doesn't hurt at all.
So I think that's exactly, I think, what we're trying to figure out, and that's the part that I've had angst is, should an image name that says MySQL colon 8.0, because I just did a quick check and maybe I'm looking at the wrong Oracle site or something, that if it's that name is the thing it's signed, and I can change the repo, I can change the registry, but I cannot change the actual image name and tag. And that's how we provide some stability in this crazy ecosystem.
What does that buy
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, I'm confused as to why would we limit ourselves to those small number of values, like the tag value and the repo name, when you've got this kind of, on the page here, we've got this kind of SBOM concept, which can have multiple values in it, can describe versions, it can describe content, and is extensible. Why would we worry about what the name of the thing is? It's like worrying about what the file name is, right?
And even adding to that too, by detaching it from the registry side, we don't have to worry about name collision, people renaming, losing track of it. And it's also important because, at least in my experience, what people define as what's important to verify in terms of like versioning and whatnot changes from container to container, product to product, company to company. In my opinion, we should provide an extensive way for, Red Hat may have some, long list of things that we need to check. MySQL might just simply say, we're just going to go with semantic versioning, or maybe we're not, maybe we're changing, maybe we used to do semantic versioning and now we want to do something different. It's ideally we want to provide the flexibility for people to be able to say, okay, this is the level of verification that we need in order to verify whatever claims that we're moving forward with. And the registry's job is simply to puppet the information back and forth.
That's more or less so my second section on here, the content model. We don't care where it came, what it came, how we got it at all. We just want to know what this thing really is. And so we basically provide means by which you can extract what internally this thing is, so you can make any kind of policy decision you want based on this really is MySQL 9, or this really was shipped by Red Hat, or whatever other content information you have in there. I think that provides a kind of straightforward model in a sense of like, this is what it is. But it does add to the complexity of decision making about deployment. You basically have to write a policy over it, because it's hard to know up front what a user's trying to do. And if we totally ignore the name of the piece of software in the registry, we can't make any assumptions about that. So we can't assume just because you pulled MySQL, just because you did MySQL.
You're breaking up, Justin.
And your config. Sorry, we can't assume just because you had the MySQL 8 image that you actually meant it to be MySQL 8. You have to specify that in an additional policy config, which
I think
definitely makes it complicated. My feeling was that it might be it's appealing but complicated was my kind of concern around this model, but not necessarily doesn't mean we don't want to do it. But it's just the complexity of having to say, I really want this.
I think you have to define a policy for what you would accept about a tag and maybe the repo name anyway, don't you?
Well, I think
it's just a much more straightforward policy if you've got a whole bunch of key value pairs to look at.
Yeah, that's the part that's the extensibility that makes me. I'm trying to figure out what's the right minimum. And what Joey was kind of talking about is that, Red Hat has got a very big policy on how they do things. It's the core of their business of how they can attest to things. And they may or may not decide to go with the SBOM format. They might have their own. but at the end of the day, there's a very minimalistic thing that is this what it says it is, which should just be nothing more than I am a thing from MySQL that happens to have a piece of text to the right of colon. There's no semantic version to it because we've pretty much proven we can't do that with container artifacts. So it's just a string. People can use semantic versioning to the right if they want, but we can't limit to that. So if we can just say that this thing is signed by this entity, that in a very simplistic state, you can use the name because the name is immutable. Or if you want something more strict, then you use an index or some other way to link to another document, possibly an SBOM, possibly a standard one, possibly a Red Hat one. And that has all of the name value pairs that you want, that you trust. From a notary perspective, all we can say is this thing is signed. What we sign, it's up to you to decide how you want to handle that particular document. But the root of what I hear us discussing is it a manifest that's signed and we have no idea what its name is? We don't care. If I point to that manifest through a tag, I can use, basically there's a GUID thing that's signed and there's a MySQL colon 8.0 that's pointing to it. I actually don't know until I read the MySQL 8.0 tag what manifest is pointing to get that. That's one approach. Or do we actually are signing MySQL 8, and whenever it moves between registries, it's always got to be MySQL colon 8.0, and we know what it is. Again, it could point to an optional extra document that has additional metadata if that's what you want to drill into.
When you are saying always has to be MySQL colon 8, are you saying that the registry name must be that and you can't copy the image under a different name? And where would that be enforced? Would that be just the client assumption?
The enforcement's an interesting question, but let's just go with the concept for a second that as the MySQL image comes out of wherever people get MySQL, let's just say it's Docker Hub. So I go get MySQL, I go to docker.io/MySQL /MySQL colon 8.0. When I copy that image into my registry, so example.com/teama/MySQL 8.0, I have to keep it as MySQL colon 8.0 regardless of what the path and registry is if we go with that model. Because if I rename it, then when somebody does a deployment on that, there's no validation that that's the right thing. The other approach is the manifest is signed, and it doesn't matter what registry, what path, what repo it is, but I really, later on when I say I'm deploying MySQL 8.0, it might actually be pointing at a completely different manifest, and that manifest wouldn't be signed by MySQL, so that you can validate it, but there's just a little bit of indirection that can get inserted there. I think that's the root of what we're discussing.
I don't think that would work with the latest stacks, which are a weird idea, but we do have latest stacks that point at a specific version and move.
When you say latest, is it literally colon latest, or you're saying there's
colon latest? Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yes, colon latest.
Okay.
You could actually have a signature, I suppose, that embeds both names in there. Then they can't be invalidated.
Yeah, I'm trying not to pick on latest because we always like to bash on latest. There's good value reasons for latest, so I'll just leave that alone.
Yeah, same here.
The same problem comes up if you have like a colon major version tag that's moving along over time, right? You say you want to run version 8, you don't care if it's 8.0 or 8.1 or 8.2. Some people care, some people don't, and you have the same exact problem again, which is if you're relying on the semantics of the tag name, then it's going to get out of sync really quickly. Versus if you had some blob or annotation or something inside the manifest that says, I am MySQL version 8, I'm signed by a key from MySQL, then the trust scenario is if I want to run a version 8 of MySQL, I ask MySQL for its key so I can verify what's signed, and then inside I look for the annotation or SBOM or whatever that says MySQL version 8 something. And with those two pieces of information, I'm always guaranteed to know that I'm running MySQL 8 point something It doesn't matter if it was literally handed to me via carrier pigeon. I know for a fact that it's correct.
Plus one.
I think it's really important that we be clear about separating the location of where the image is and how to find it in a registry from the content that we're trying to validate. And so, like, this is the same thing that I'm sorry, I don't know what your name was who was just speaking, but the same thing about how we have some sort of maybe metadata that gets embedded in the image that we can verify, but we're not reliant on the specific name of that when we go to pull the image.
Yeah, this was Joey from the Quake team. And yeah, I agree.
Thanks, Joey.
I really want a clear separation of concern between what the bits represent and where it comes from, because again, like we know of people who literally sneaker neck their stuff into their clusters on USB sticks, and if they're going to be dumping these things as tar gzips onto their USB sticks and then walking it across the doorway and plugging it into their system, we can't rely on naming for that at all unless we're very, very careful. But if there's something inside of the manifest that says, hey, this is the thing that I say I am, and it's signed by a key who I trust to attest to that, then the problem is solved, and it doesn't really matter how you get the bits and bytes in. And that's why I'm personally in favor of that.
I mean, if we are separating the location and the identification, it doesn't matter whether it's in the signature, inside the signed artifact, anywhere. And I agree that we shouldn't prescriptively restrict the names in the repos. Another way to look at it is if you are copying the image to a different repo, you are anyway extremely likely to have a local configuration for the trusted keys. Or you can just use trust on first use share. But once you actually deploy the public keys in advance, you already have a policy configuration in there, and that would be the place to also deploy any kind of naming considerations. And for the most part, you already have the data when you are building the mirroring setup. It's just a matter of deploying it.
Well, it does seem that if you have the policy, if you don't have that naming binding, then per deployment or whatever, you want to somehow enforce the tag within the deployment itself. So your policy would be cluster-wide as well as deployment-specific, right? So if you're deploying something, you want to say that this image, it has to be SQL version 3.1. Because you could just point to any other image with a good provenance, and then cluster-wide policy would say it should be above run.
I think the question we're kind of circling around is, what is the resolution of names and verification? So in the distribution spec and the image spec and all these different specs, the only thing that's fundamentally has to be unique is the digest and the manifest ID, right? That's the thing that's actually unique. And when I say manifest ID, I'm also referring to index that points to things as well. Now, we can rename things all we want. There's tagging, there's mutable tagging, there's immutable, mutable, both of them. So at deployment time, if I'm deploying to a runtime and I deploy it as foo::bar, but I say that I only allow things to be run in this environment that are signed by a list of keys, MySQL being one of them, and I have a policy that says this particular thing, I was trying to figure out how do I know this is MySQL, this particular artifact must be at least version 7.1, 7.0 and above, that it gets foo::bar, it looks back and says, this is signed by one of the keys I validate, I am good. I don't know where I figure out, I guess in this case, if I've got such a rich policy, either I can do a minimalistic of it has to be signed by one of these keys, and that's good enough. If I want to go further, then there has to be some agreement between the policy manager and what it's evaluating. What I'm suggesting is you either we could use OPA and SBOM as a reference implementation, assuming those happen. And we could say, this is how you could look that this thing, foo::bar, points to a digest, but that digest definitively points to an SBOM. And in that SBOM, it says it's MySQL. It says maybe it's a database. It says it's 7.1 with this compiler and this list of packages. And now the policy management can read that detailed piece of metadata and do whatever analysis it wants and decide whether it lets it go or not. But at the very minimal, we at least know that that artifact was signed by the MySQL org, and that's the minimal that all we're going to promise for in the minimal. If you want to do more, you do more with the other things I mentioned.
The other interesting thing about, sorry about that, guys. The other interesting thing about that approach is you could have a hypothetical scenario where, like, let's say you have an internal team that verifies specific versions of databases or whatever. You could have that team re-sign the manifest with the following attestation, like, I allow any manifest that's signed with, supported database equals true, and signed by one of my internal keys as well. And then we only allow those to run on a cluster. So it could be MySQL, it could be Postgres, or specific versions thereof. And we do the verification with the other key, but we also do it with our own key. And now we have this nice layered attestation effect where, let's say you want to promote an image from staging to production, you only allow it to run if it's signed with an attestation internally that says ready for production, true, and signed by a production key on top of everything else.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the third model in my dark, the claims model, and you could, I mean, again, as I said, you can combine these models potentially, but you can also, I mean, with that model, you would have someone who read the SBOM and then just said, I've looked at the SBOM, this one looks good for this purpose or whatever, or this seems to be signed by a key we trust or whatever. But you can have if you do that as part of the pipeline, then you can have a much simpler experience at the client end where you're actually trying to run the thing. It just has to validate the claims are okay for it. And it doesn't have to have code to, for example, read SBOMs at all at the deployment point. It can just say, oh, well, Steve Lasker says this is good to go into production, so I can go into production because that's that's the signature I trust for production use or whatever. So you would potentially have a model where you have some component in your pipeline that goes through the detailed bit of reading the SBOM and not try and do that at prod time and try and make it simpler at the actual deployment point. So that would be the kind, and we've definitely had a lot, I mean, we had a lot of customers who do think that promotion type policy and sign promotions and things like that are the way that they like to think about signatures.
Yeah, we have the same thing. We've had a lot of customers who've asked about this very specific idea of having a specific pipeline and going from test to staging, security verification, support verification, production sign off, and making sure that things that run in particular clusters have met all of these necessary steps. And further, that if one of the particular steps there's a flaw found in the process, that they can go and audit what was it signed with what version of the process, and can we identify those images that are running and maybe pull them all back, things like that.
That can work well, but it's also easy to get wrong. If you have a claim that is immutable, like this was tested yesterday, sure, that can be signed. If you have a claim where you can change your mind later, like this is an approved database that can change 2 weeks later when there is an upgrade, then the signature is going to persist, or you must have some way to make that signature invalid later. Now, Notary V1 does have that functionality, but it depends on having the concept of a repository with a history. In other words, it kind of depends on there being a name for that repository that is persistent throughout time.
Yeah, I think we've gotten rid of the names. That part we're fine, but you bring up an interesting question, because what I heard Justin and Joey talk about is regardless, I have a bunch of policy that takes time to compute and logic and so forth. and through claims, I can put another signature. So basically I have a prod key that I sign things with, that anything can be in dev that is signed. Let's just say that anything that's signed in dev is fine, but prod only gets deployments if they're signed with the prod key. In the example that Meter brought up is, I have a policy that things that are signed with the prod key are in prod, but later on I find a problem with one of those things. I don't want to revoke the prod key because that invalidates everything. I want to change a policy that says this particular thing or a collection of things have this package that turns out to be vulnerable. I need to go back and find all the specific things that have been deployed that have that vulnerability. I don't know, like things that are already running, generally speaking, people don't like shutting them down. They might block new deployments of them, but at least you have a way to identify, because you would have SBOMs or other scans that you're doing. You know the things that went in production were only things that were previously confirmed. You can stop new things from going there, but you have the standard remediation problem of something's running, it's got a problematic thing. I don't want to just shut it off by default. I want to handpick and go get them, because shutting it off might cause more damage than the vulnerability in the first place. But you do have that raw data.
I mean, I think you've got the same issue with any of these mechanisms. I mean, with SBOM, if you've attached, you've attached scans, and it looks fine, and then you discover that it's not fine anymore. And I think that's going to be an issue regardless. The question is, I guess, whether we want to provide mechanisms to rectify that, or mechanisms like short signature expiries that you have to re-sign, or whether we just consider that's out of scope. So I think we need to decide if that's in or out of scope or not. And
from our perspective,
I think most of this should just be an HTTPS query, not a signature that is copied along with the image.
From our perspective, I'm sorry.
What do you mean by that exactly?
I mean, if you have an approval status that can change from true to false and back, and you want to get the current status of that approval, you just ask a server over HTTPS and you get guarantees the freshest result. It's weird and surprising and hard to manage to make it a signed artifact that is part of the image and that is copied along with the image, and then you either have signatures that are expiring every day and you have to resign them, and you get 1-day resolution instead of 1-second resolution if you just ask over HTTPS. Of course, disconnected throws a wrench into things, but my intuition is that for most of these policies, they just shouldn't be in the signature. The signature is for immutable aspects.
I think that the way to look at it is the signed claim represents some point in time set of data and not the current set of data. So you could use a claim to say, I scanned this image at this particular time, and maybe here's an identifier that you can use to look at results, but not like this image is approved. Because the approvedness of the image can change, but the fact that you scanned it is something that doesn't change.
Exactly. Like from our perspective, security information about an image is dynamic. It's one of the few reasons that we feel so strongly that like having attestations about like this image is clean of vulnerabilities doesn't make sense, because that changes from minute to minute. So from our perspective, discovering of security vulnerability issues is something that should be done with like on cluster, like pulling on cluster index information, which is why we built an operator for that. But in terms of like, I was more referencing the idea of like something that's statically true, like signed by somebody who's trusted, and then it turns out that person is no longer not actually to be trusted. How do you verify that? Well, if there was some internal attestation that says like built by, I don't know, I'm gonna say Evan, and then Evan becomes untrusted, I can easily go look at the attestation list for my previous images and say, okay, which one of these images says built by Evan? And then now I can make a decision of what the remediation effort is. Was it because Evan was throwing, malware into our images and or mining coins, or is it just because we want to be sure, things like that. So I think using security, like vulnerability status is probably not the best example because it's so dynamic and changing so often, but like attestations of like who built this or how this was built, maybe we discovered there was a bug in our pipeline and it didn't do the full set of checks. That can all be handled with just basic attestations, and you can use either like a version code or an identifier. It's all very specific to your particular build pipeline.
So I'm just going to interject. We're at 2 minutes. Great discussions. I think we'll continue. I'll continue to promote our Notary channel on Slack as our main form of communication. I'll work with Justin and others to get.
I think I might try and write a follow-up doc about the kind of.
Yeah, I was just actually going to say we need a place to keep all the pointers to docs. So I'll work with the various people to we'll figure it out. I don't know what it'll be yet. I don't know whether it's a PR or something on the spec or whatever, but we're getting a lot of great content to read, but they're in various different places. So I'll work with the folks to figure out where that'll be. And I will put a reminder to myself on Fridays that on the Slack channel, I will remind people, here's the agenda for the following Monday. So with that, we should wrap up and follow up on Slack and other communication for other stuff. Thanks, folks. This is awesome. Oh, thanks. And KubeCon, we're still working it out. Now that sessions have been somewhat approved as the calendar lands, we should be able to get a better handle on when we're proposed this conversation to happen in person there. Till next week.
Have a good day, guys.
Thanks. Thank you.